Hello and welcome. I'm Carol Cram, host of the Art and Fiction podcast. This episode features Ana Veciana-Suarez, author of Dulcinea, listed in the literature category on Art in Fiction. Ana is the author of several books, including The Chin Kiss King, that was nominated for the prestigious IMPAC Award, an international competition in Dublin. Two of her nonfiction books about the Hispanic media were published by the Media Institute, a think tank in Washington, D.C. Her commentary has been included in several anthologies, in addition to Reader's Digest, O Magazine, Woman's Day, The Washington Post magazine, Parenting, and Latina. Ana immigrated to Miami at the age of 6 and has 5 adult children who she likes to say have taught her immeasurable humility. Welcome to the Art and Fiction podcast, Ana.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's my pleasure. I so enjoyed Dulciana. It tells the story of Dolça, the fictional muse behind Don Quixote. So first off, can you describe the story?
So this is the story of a woman, fictional woman, who I imagine to be the fictional muse of Miguel Cervantes. She's a wealthy lady from Barcelona. They meet and they have this star-crossed love affair. And when he's on his deathbed, he writes her a note and asks her to come from Barcelona to Madrid so he can see her one last time. And so the story is a dual timeline, same person, kind of now and then. So one timeline is her journey across Spain, facing all kinds of problems. It's not like taking a plane. There are bandits, there's the Inquisition, you have to sleep under the stars, illnesses, all manner of obstacles. And then the past tense lines, the then timeline is her remembering their love, the past love, and her life.
So why did you choose to tell the story in a dual timeline? That really intrigued me. I think it worked really well, but you could have done it sequentially, right?
I had never written a dual timeline, so
Right.
This was new to me. And I knew when I sat down and said, this is the book I'm going to write next, I knew two things about it. Didn't know much about the era, but I knew the book had to have a journey, because that's what Cervantes' most famous book, of course, is this journey. And I knew that I wanted the muse to be from Barcelona. My family's originally from that area. I visit family there. And part of me said, oh, I can go ahead and do all this research and have it tax deductible. And then I realized, as I started plotting and working through, that I had to get back to the idea of how they met and how they came apart and how they came back together. And the only way to do this was in these more extended flashbacks.
Right. It worked really, really well. So I just want to circle back to Cervantes. Why Cervantes?
Well, back in 10th grade, we were living in La Paz, Bolivia, and I was in Spanish 4, and I reread, and of course, Spanish literature, among them Miguel Cervantes, and not just his most famous Don Quixote, but I always thought reading it in the original Spanish, which I tried and had a really hard time. So I guess I've lost some brain cells in the process. I thought, she is always the woman who stands in for Dulcinea, his muse that he imagines, because there's really no real Dulcinea, is mostly off the page. She's never a central figure on the page where she is like a real scene. And he, of course, the way he imagines her, she's a barmaid, nothing like what he thinks she is. And I thought one day I am going to write her story, my invented story. Well, 50 years later, I got
Funny.
around to it.
That's how, especially novel writing, I think works. It takes years to sort of percolate, doesn't it?
Yeah, and a lot of it was, as I said, I didn't know much about that period, and I knew I was going to have to do a lot of research, and I really didn't have the time. I was a working mother, had a career in journalism, and it just, even before I sat down to plan anything, I pretty much read for about a year and a half, at least a couple dozen books. So,
Mhm.
like 5 or 6 biographies of Cervantes, that kind of thing. So I could feel confident that I could write with some authority about that era.
Yes, it's funny. I can't remember when I read Don Quixote. I did read it. And I love Spain because I go to Spain a lot. As a matter of fact, I'm going there in 2 more months.
Oh, lucky you.
My husband has a exhibition. He's an artist in Santiago de Compostela. So we are
Oh,
in Spain this time. But I have been to all the places that you mentioned in the novel. I love that you went to Zaragoza because you never hear about
mhm.
Zaragoza. That's a really interesting place, isn't it?
Yes, it is. I mean, there's a lot that I learned. Even as I said, I have family. I see them on a semi-regular basis. But when I finished, I told my agent, my late agent, this is the last historical fiction I write because it people don't realize that I figured that if I used 10% of the research, it was too much. But I felt I needed that. And I know from meeting other historical fiction authors, it's the same thing, as you well know. And then getting it down, making sure that everything is as authentic and you're as true to the facts as possible is also very time consuming. But of course, never say never, and I'm back to kind of the same era. But I
Yes, get
guess it
some
just
use.
became fascinating.
Yes, you want to get some use out of all of that research and write another one.
Hmm.
And I wanted to talk about that, the research or that the period. So you really bring to life the late 16th century in Spain. Tell us about that period and also the constraints people lived under, because of course it was during the time of the Spanish Inquisition.
Right, right. Well, because at least half of the book is really constrained to Barcelona, and what a lot of people don't know is there was a Principality of Catalonia, and even though they belonged to Aragon and were under the much hated Madrid, they had they are and they have their own language, different customs. They had their constitution, their fueros, which are like their rights, and so on. So I knew all this in general just because of family. My mother was born there. My grandparents on both sides were born and lived there, and so I knew, but I didn't know 16th century. And even though, of course, you see the old walls when you tour, so I really wanted to get a feel. I started with what I knew, and then kind of worked on a broader level about Spain and the customs. So some people, for example, don't realize the kind of civil power the Inquisition had. We all know it as a religious organization, but we don't, or at least I didn't know, and how women had some agency in the sense that they inherited, and it depended on the provinces and so on. But once they went from their father to the man their parents picked for them to marry, to form allegiances and alliances, and kind of that was it. And you were expected to be a good wife and mother and then live your life in this way. But I found in my research as I studied more, so most of my research was in Spanish, but I was able to find a lot of kind of primary sources in Catalan. So I can read it relatively well. When I couldn't, I would ask my cousins to help. So I found like a diary of a tanner. I found a weather log. So I know, of course, the weather in Barcelona now, and winter tends to be relatively temperate, even though they're on the same latitude as New York. Well, back in the 1600s, especially in the early 1600s, they went through what was called a little ice age. And there were people who actually kept this information. I found these, I guess, and not necessarily, it was more of a travel log of muleteers describing the roads and the inns and what was offered. So it was like a wonderful source, particularly when in talking about research. I had applied for a fellowship to do research at the end of 2019. And I got the money in February of 2020 and was going to go in late March, early April. And we all know what happened in 2020. And I kept thinking, so I said, oh, I'm not going to let this stop me. I'm like doing that. I kept asking, well, my cousins, hey, do you think I can go? And they said, oh, this is closed, that is closed, I'll go. And they had it really bad. But there's the internet, and it's amazing what you can find on everything from YouTube to Google Street Maps. And
It's amazing. So you did you go before you ended
I
up finishing the book?
eventually
Yeah.
did, like a couple years ago, and I'm due now to to go back. And by then I had started researching my next book, but I then went to all the places that I thought, okay, this is what I'm modeling from memory, where Dolça would have lived or walked or done, because you visit it until you actually go with a writer's eye, is it's different.
You really
So,
do need to go to the place, I find. There's just something about it because it's the air. I mean, even
mhm,
though it's very different now, obviously,
yeah.
but still your imagination goes on overdrive. So yeah, we love Google Street Maps, but actually going there is amazing, isn't
But
it?
I think, at least what I'm familiar with in Barcelona, and I think also big parts of Europe, they tend to be more respectful of history. So I
Yes.
live in Miami. I pretty much grew up in Miami. I've spent all my adult life in Miami, and they'll discover something from some native tribe and they just kind of build over it. They move the artifacts, which is not what you see in Barcelona or Tarragona or anything. I grew up, of course, with all these Catalonian foods. And I then found a 15th century cookbook, and they were cooking some of those same dishes back
Wow.
then.
I love that you said you found a muleteer's diary of the journey. What a resource. That's like
Oh
every
my
writer's
gosh,
dream.
yes, yes.
So I wanted to talk a little bit more about Dolce. So Dolce is an artist, and I could just have easily have put the novel in the visual arts category, actually. So although she's a woman, she is able to pursue her art. Why did you decide to make her a painter?
Well, I wanted to give her something that she loved to do that came naturally to her, but that she didn't pay attention to, that she basically squandered some opportunities, just took it for granted. Because I thought that would serve as a contrast to Cervantes, who not only the socioeconomic differences between the two of them and the geographic differences, which were huge. We don't realize because now we take a bullet and train and go to Saragossa, all these places. And I thought this would be one. And I doubted that she could have been a woman writer. I couldn't find much of that,
Yes.
but or any of that. I mean, there was a nun that I found that had done some writing, but in painting, a lot of women were were painting, and painters that whose names we don't really know because, of course, they were relegated to to obscurity because they were women. But what happened, how I decided, oh, she's going to be a painter and this is going to be her passion. I happened to stumble on the name of a woman court painter in, I think it was Philip II's reign, and she was a court painter, which was a big deal.
You're talking about Sophonisba, right?
Yes, yes.
Yes. I mean, actually, I interviewed someone on the podcast who wrote a novel about Sophonisba because I was thinking about her as I was reading your novel. It's really true that there were a lot of women painters, way more than we thought, right? And they are
Yes.
finally starting to get their due. There's a lot more exhibitions, especially in Europe, of women painters, particularly like Sophonisba. She just had one not very long ago. So it worked really well that Dolça was an artist, and it lets us know as a modern reader that yes, women were painting, women were doing things.
Exactly.
And I really enjoyed that aspect of the novel. I thought that was really smart too, to make her have something in addition to being a wife and a mother and a rich woman and all of that, but she had something of her own. And her relationship to her painting evolves in the novel, doesn't it? Because of her relationship with Cervantes. You want to talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, because at the beginning, she would ask her father to get her a painting tutor, which is what she wanted and wanted and wanted. And he did. Her father doted on her. The mother thought it would, as you well know, actually hurt her marriage prospects, and that would be something that a husband might not look kindly on. But she didn't pursue it as she should, while we all know Cervantes was not only passionate, he was just obsessed with it and went through so much to be able to get to where he was, always looking for patrons so he could continue writing. And she had this essentially given to her. So it provided another contrast. Now, the problem was I didn't know very much about painting. So I do have a niece who studied art history and works at a museum, but not so much about 16th century. So she kind of guided me. That was like a second load of research to do it. And I thought, oh, well, they go to a store and buy the tube of things. And when I would read what they had to do, not just to prepare the canvas, because I know to do it, but just their colors, their palette, it really blew my mind.
It is amazing. I know, because my first novel is about a painter in 14th century, but the techniques had actually not changed all that much, although she probably would be painting in oils by that time rather than tempera.
Yeah.
So what would you say is the theme of Dulcinea?
For me, it was really about a woman coming into her and looking back at her life and understanding the choices she made, realizing that maybe she should have taken some leaps of faith and didn't. So I don't want to give too much away. But it was really about the second chances we get in life and what we can do to seize them and not be afraid. And I think the painting also, her returning to painting also kind of underscores that more. And I think we all get to an age in later midlife where you look back and think, if I had done this, what would have happened? And I say to young people, I say to my children, my grandchildren, the teenagers who might understand this, I said, the things I regret are the things I didn't do, not the things I did, but the things I didn't do. The opportunities I was afraid to take, the risks I was afraid to take. And I think this is really what the book is about. And maybe I couldn't have written that book any earlier. Maybe it had to wait that time.
Well, your own life kind of bears that out because it's a second chance to at a new career. Because you
Right.
like myself, you've come to writing novels later in your career or after your main career was over, which is not unusual. That's a very common theme I find. And I think, as we said earlier, it takes decades to do this, to become a writer.
But you're learning. People say, well, how to write. But no, I wrote on deadline, had feedback, if not daily, at least within 2 days of anything. It's a very short form. Yeah. Even when I was doing what we call in journalism longer form of 1,500 or 2,000, but that's not even a chapter.
No, that's like a day's work. Yeah, right. Yeah, well, maybe not for me, but no, I know it's a very different type of writing. I wrote textbooks for decades, but you'd think that would prepare me for writing novels, but not particularly. I think what does prepare us with your journalism and the work I did is the idea of actually working. You're used to working. You're used to writing every day, and you're not waiting for inspiration, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's very valuable.
And I keep pretty much the same hours that I did. And I still do freelance a couple times a week. Yeah. And that'll vary. It's either feast or famine. But it's the sitting down, and sometimes I don't want to do it. Sometimes I'm thinking, well, I probably should do the wash, or I know somebody's in town and everybody's going out, and you have to have that self-discipline. Yes, that I think working at something else teaches you, because you're your own boss as a writer.
Absolutely. So would you like to do a short reading for us from Dulcinea?
Sure. So I figured I'd start at the beginning, which is the prologue. So it's the 29th of April, 1616, Madrid, in which I am where I should be at last. Much has been said about me, much written, and most of it such slanderous tripe, lies, deceits, falsehoods, a deflowering of the truth. Of all the woes visited upon me by God, and perhaps the devil himself, having my reputation besmirched has been, if not the most painful or long-lasting, certainly one of the most confounding. I've done nothing to deserve this calumny, except to love a man who isn't my husband and never can be, a man who belongs to another. I loved him before the bittersweet elixir of fame, before I danced my first sardana or prepared my first palette with paint. And I've loved him as steadily as the Llobregat flows to the Mediterranean, and as predictably as the budding of the king's trees in spring. This is why my carriage has stopped in front of an unfamiliar building on a strange city, in a strange street in a city foreign to me. I cannot move my feet, and my arms hang limply at my sides. Only my hammering heart is awake. However, I must rouse myself if I am to accomplish my mission. A secret release will lighten the heaviness of heart that has beset me so. Calle de Leon, the driver announces. Though small, the house possesses a respectable air, and this surprises me. Miguel has always lamented his financial situation. Yet the green shutters appear freshly painted, and red geraniums fill the window boxes. Rose bushes bloom in a side garden. Suddenly, I'm startled by the neighing of a horse at the carriage window. Jaume has dismounted and appears eager to get on with the task at hand. He is accustomed to assuming control, and proof of this is how well he oversees my late husband's affairs. Is this the address? He asks. I've never been here, but if it matches what I gave you, it doesn't look like anyone's home. He eyes the property as if sizing up an unwanted purchase. A dying man wouldn't be left alone. Very well. Who should I ask for? I hesitate, dread squeezing my throat, but manage to reply. I don't know anyone in the household except Miguel. And who shall I say has come calling? Me. Who else? Are you sure? He asks, doubt creasing his brow. Yes, most definitely. Is Jaume dallying? After all, he has escorted me here only after a considerable number of threats and simpering on my part. Though I originally intended to keep my journey from him, as he would have forbidden it in his high-handed way, I will concede that his presence has afforded me comfort these past days. But there may be some objection, I finish for him. I understand, but there's not much I can do about that now. Just go ahead and tell the maid. So I figured I'd end there, and it goes on. Or
No, that's perfect. And I really enjoyed hearing that because of course I just finished the novel not very long ago. So no spoilers, but so when you read the prologue, I go, oh, okay. I kind of took me back to how the whole novel unfolds. So that's great. Thank you so much. One of my goals with the Art and Fiction podcast is to inspire other authors. So, what's one thing you've learned from writing your novels that you didn't know before?
I think there's so many things. If we are going to go in art, was the fact that women painters, and there was a good number of them, had worked, had learned, had apprenticed among with famous masters, and had produced incredible work, and that we lost them
Yeah.
in history. And in some cases I read there were men who took credit for these things. So to me that was because I, in my own way, only truly thought, especially in that era, that it was men, because those were the painters I knew, those were the painters I had studied or heard about, were men. So that was very eye-opening to me. And then another thing I learned, and I think this was in general in Europe, but especially in Spain, how much the Catholic Church controlled the theme, the subject matter, I would say, and the themes of painters. And the way to survive was, of course, you could have your wealthy patrons, but was to get commissions from a diocese here, a cathedral from there, which is so different from now. And I had never thought of that before, even though I've visited tons of churches, and of course they've had those triptychs and they're all over everywhere. But I never connected those things. And then on a personal level is I've never really thought that much about my heritage and of Catalonia. So, and it's on both sides of the family. And I just took a lot of things for granted. But then when I started researching, when I realized how the foods I would eat on holidays were foods that have been around for centuries, the customs, all these things, that gave me a special tie to where my people were from. I wasn't born in Spain. I was born in Cuba, came here. So my family lived 3 generations in 3 different countries, spoke 3 different languages.
Wow.
And now I'm kind of reconnecting, and in more than, oh, let's go visit the cousins or let's go visit this, but what hundreds of years and how many dozens of generations lived there.
Yeah.
So that to me was kind of a personal bonus.
Isn't it wonderful as historical novelists that we can do that? Like my most recent novel that I'm working on right now is based on my own heritage in Yorkshire. So yeah, we can explore all that. It's great fun.
Yeah, I know.
So can you share with us what you're working on now?
Well, I had told my agent at the time, my late agent, that this was the last of the historical novels, and I had 2 or 3 different ideas cooking up. And I like to be working on something all the time, even if it's just sitting there percolating. And there was this one idea that kept popping back for a very unusual reason. And while I was doing the research for Dulcinea, I'd go down these rabbit holes that I would look up. I'm sure, Carol, you would understand. And I'm like, oh my God, I've lost all this time. And one of them, I had found a thesis, I'm pretty sure it was from Ohio State, and it had caught my eye because it was about Catalonia, and it was during this little known war of secession from Spain, as in Madrid. And of course, Catalonia has been doing that. They just did that some years ago. They tried to do an independence movement. So it's not new. It's been going on for centuries. But what caught me was essentially what this graduate student was postulating was that this little known war of secession was the first war that used modern journalism in the forms of pamphlets and broadsheets and newsletters to sway the populace. They were those days influencers. And the more I read about it, I was saying, because as a journalist, I go, wow, this is incredible. And then I read more. I would backtrack and go and look and research. So my next novel, it takes place during essentially about a 2.5 year period of this very long war. And it's fascinating. I got to go back to Spain using the grant money that I could use for Dulcinea.
What is the period in history?
Well, this war gave voice to what is now the national anthem of Catalonia. And what happened, it was a war within the war of Spain against France.
So what's the dates?
So it was 1639 through 1659.
Oh, okay.
So the war I take, because it's really more about when they try to secede, and for various reasons that lend themselves to a narrative, is between 1639 and 1641.
Wow, that's interesting. Yeah, no, I knew nothing about that period. So that's going to be fun. Are you almost finished that, or?
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay,
I always say, I hope Jeopardy one day has 17th century Spain, and I'm going to apply.
You're just
I'm going to go
ace
there,
it.
and I'm going to be like Ken Jennings and win it all.
Well, thank you so much, Ana, for talking with me today. I've really
thank
enjoyed
you.
it.
It's been a pleasure. I'm delighted to be finally on this podcast. So, and I hope to see you in Las Vegas.
Yes, I will definitely
for the
see you
Historical
there.
Novel Society Conference.
Yep, the Historical Novel Society Conference in Vegas. Absolutely. I've been speaking with Ana Veciana-Suarez, author of Dulcinea, listed in the literature category on Art and Fiction at www.artandfiction.com. Be sure to check the show notes for a link to Ana's website at www.anaveciana-suarez.com. If you are enjoying the Art and Fiction podcast, please help us keep the lights on by making a donation to the Ko-fi website at ko-fi.com art and fiction. Also, please follow Art and Fiction on Facebook and Instagram. And don't forget to give the Art and Fiction podcast a positive review or rating wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks so much for listening.